It was a busy afternoon at a small local store in a quiet neighborhood. People were coming and going, picking up their groceries, chatting with each other, and going about their day. The store had an old charm, with wooden shelves lined with everything from canned goods to fresh produce. It wasn't the biggest or most glamorous store, but it was the heart of the community. For many people, it was a place they knew they could rely on. Behind the counter stood the store manager, a middle-aged woman named Lydia, who had been working there for years. Her face was often hard to read, a mix of sternness and quiet determination. She ran the store like clockwork, always making sure everything was in order. She didn't have much patience for anyone who wasn't following the rules. People who didn't respect the place or its unwritten rules quickly learned to avoid her. Lydia didn't mind keeping things orderly, even if it meant being a bit strict at times. That afternoon, as the store buzzed with activity, a group of kids entered, laughing and joking. They were a mix of different ages, some a little younger, some older. Their energy was contagious, and for a moment it seemed to lift the mood in the store. They moved in and out of the aisles, chatting loudly, their voices echoing off the walls. Among them was a young boy, about 12 years old, whose name was Elijah. He wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, just being a kid, goofing around with his friends, making jokes and laughing at whatever came to his mind. But the noise caught Lydia's attention. She'd been busy organizing some shelves near the back of the store when the group of kids had entered, and the noise they made only grew louder as they wandered through the aisles. The store wasn't huge, and it was easy to hear every conversation that happened. But today, the kids seemed to be pushing things a bit too far. The sound of their laughter echoed around her, and before long, she noticed them heading toward the display of fragile glass vases near the front. Elijah, not paying attention, bumped into one of the shelves holding the vases. The shelf wobbled, and a few items slid off, crashing to the floor. The sound of the glass breaking was loud, and it made everyone in the store stop for a moment. People turned to look, and the kids quickly froze, their faces flushing with embarrassment. Elijah's friends looked at each other, some of them giggling nervously, unsure of what to do. Lydia's heart raced, and her frustration grew. She had seen this kind of thing happen before. It wasn't the first time a child had caused a small accident in the store, but what bothered her more was the way the kids didn't seem to care about it. They weren't immediately apologizing or offering to help clean up the mess. Instead, they seemed more interested in laughing about it. That was the part that bothered Lydia the most. She couldn't stand disrespect, especially in her store. She quickly strode over to where the kids were standing, all of them still looking at the broken glass. "What do you think you're doing?" Lydia snapped, her voice firm. "Do you have any idea how much those cost?" The kids looked at her, some of them wide-eyed, others trying to avoid eye contact. Elijah, who had accidentally bumped into the shelf, stood still, his hands at his sides. He didn't know what to say. He hadn't meant to break anything, but now it felt like the whole store was focused on him, and he didn't know how to make it right. He wasn't used to being in trouble like this, and the pressure of the situation started to make him feel more and more uncomfortable. Lydia took a deep breath, trying to keep her temper in check, but she couldn't help herself. "You need to clean this up. Now," she ordered, looking directly at Elijah. Elijah's friends shifted awkwardly, glancing around as if waiting for someone else to step in, but no one did. They all stayed quiet, unsure of how to handle the situation. Elijah felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. He had never been scolded like this before, especially not in front of his friends. As he bent down to pick up the pieces of glass, Lydia kept her gaze on him. She was waiting for him to apologize, but Elijah, who was too nervous, didn't say anything. He focused on the broken glass, his hands trembling slightly as he carefully gathered the pieces. The other kids watched from a distance, unsure of what to do. The situation was uncomfortable for everyone, and the longer it dragged on, the more Elijah wished he could just disappear. Lydia continued to stand there, her arms crossed, watching the kids closely. She didn't understand why they weren't showing more remorse. It wasn't the first time she'd had to deal with rowdy kids in the store, but this time something felt different. She felt an urge to make an example out of Elijah, to show him the consequences of careless actions. "You should know better," she muttered under her breath as she watched him struggle to pick up the broken glass. "This store has rules, and you'll need to follow them if you want to come in here." Elijah didn't respond. He felt a lump form in his throat and his cheeks burned. It was one thing to be scolded at school or by his parents, but this felt different. He was embarrassed. His friends weren't saying anything either, and that made him feel even worse. It wasn't like he had meant to break the vase or cause any trouble. It was just an accident, a stupid mistake. But now it felt like he was being treated like a criminal. As he picked up the last piece of glass, his mind raced. He wanted to explain himself, to tell Lydia that it had been an accident, but the words didn't come out. Instead, he stayed silent, unsure of what to say. His friends, too, remained quiet, all of them uncertain about how to handle the situation. Just then, the door to the store opened, and a woman walked in. She was tall, with a confident stride. She had just finished a busy morning of meetings and had come in to grab a few things. She didn't expect to walk into what she did. As soon as the woman entered, her eyes were drawn to her son, Elijah, who was still on the floor picking up the pieces of the broken vase. The woman's face softened when she saw him, but when she looked up, she noticed the manager standing over him. There was something about the way Lydia was watching the boy that made her feel uneasy. She had a sense that something wasn't quite right, but she couldn't place it just yet. "Hey, is everything okay?" the woman asked, her voice calm but concerned. She walked toward Elijah, her gaze shifting between him and the manager. Lydia straightened up slightly, ready to explain herself, but she wasn't prepared for what would happen next. The woman's gaze sharpened as she asked her next question, one that would change everything. "Why is my son on the floor picking at the woman?" who had walked into the store with calm confidence, looked down at her son who was still crouched on the floor, picking up pieces of broken glass. Her heart sank when she saw his face pale and tense, his hands shaking slightly as he carefully gathered the sharp fragments. She knew something wasn't right. The quiet discomfort in the store was telling enough. "Hey, Elijah, are you okay?" she asked, crouching down to his level. Her voice was gentle, but there was an edge of concern in it. Elijah slowly looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mix of confusion and embarrassment. He opened his mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. The woman's gaze shifted to Lydia, who was standing off to the side, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The manager had been watching, her eyes cold and unblinking. The woman's intuition kicked in, and she could feel that something was off. She could see the way Lydia's eyes flicked from her son to the broken glass as though waiting for something to happen. "What happened here?" the woman asked, her tone steady but firm. She addressed Lydia directly now, her gaze unwavering. Lydia didn't immediately respond. She shifted her stance and glanced around, clearly uncomfortable under the woman's questioning look. The tension in the store seemed to grow heavier, everyone holding their breath, waiting for the next move. Lydia cleared her throat before speaking. "Your son," he knocked over one of the displays. "I told him to clean it up. That's all," she said, her voice a little defensive, but there was no remorse in her words. The woman's brows furrowed as she listened, unsure if she had heard correctly. The way Lydia was speaking made it sound like Elijah was being punished for something minor, as if it were a simple mistake. She looked back at her son, who was still crouching on the floor, struggling with the broken glass. Elijah's shoulders were slumped and his eyes were filled with discomfort, the sting of embarrassment obvious. He didn't look like someone who had been careless for no reason. He looked like someone who had been made to feel small. The woman's heart ached for him. She could see that he wasn't acting out of malice. Just a child in an unfamiliar situation, unsure of how to respond. "Elijah, you can stand up now, sweetheart," she said gently, extending her hand toward him. Elijah hesitated for a moment, then took her hand and stood up slowly. He still didn't say anything. The woman's attention turned back to Lydia. She could see the tension in Lydia's posture, the way her arms were still tightly crossed as she stood there, almost daring the woman to challenge her authority. The woman took a deep breath. She needed to understand what was really happening here. "Lydia, is this really how you treat children in your store? You do realize this is just an accident, right?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp, making it clear that she wasn't backing down. Lydia shifted uncomfortably, but she didn't respond right away. She glanced at the other customers in the store who had all stopped what they were doing and were now watching the scene unfold. Some of them looked uncomfortable, others simply curious, but no one spoke up. The quiet atmosphere in the store made it feel like the weight of the situation was only growing heavier. The woman's gaze moved over the other customers, noticing their avoidance, and she felt a knot form in her stomach. Finally, Lydia spoke again, her voice now sounding a little less certain. "I was just trying to keep the store in order. Kids need to learn discipline. They can't just break things and walk away like nothing happened." The woman looked at her for a moment, considering her words. She was trying to keep her emotions in check, but it was clear to her now that the way Lydia had handled the situation was more about asserting power than offering guidance. Elijah hadn't meant to break the vase, and he certainly hadn't deserved to be treated like a criminal. "You don't think it's a bit much to slap a child for something like this?" the woman asked, her voice calm but filled with authority. Lydia's eyes widened slightly, clearly surprised by the woman's directness. "Excuse me?" Lydia said, her voice a bit sharper now, but still defensive. "Don't act like you didn't just slap him," the woman replied, her gaze unwavering. "He's just a kid, and this was an accident, and you made him feel like it was something to be ashamed of." Lydia opened her mouth to respond, but the words didn't come out. Instead, she stood there speechless, unsure of how to defend her actions. The woman had hit a nerve, and Lydia was struggling to find a way to justify what she had done. The woman turned back to her son, who was now standing a little taller, though his hands were still trembling. She placed a hand on his shoulder and gave him a reassuring smile. "It's okay, Elijah," she said softly. "You didn't mean to break anything. Don't worry about it." Elijah looked up at her, his face still pale but slowly starting to relax at her words. The woman then turned her attention back to Lydia. "This isn't how we teach kids right from wrong. You could have just asked him to be more careful next time. Instead, you decided to punish him in front of everyone like he did something terrible." Lydia's face reddened and she looked away. She didn't know how to respond. In the back of her mind, she knew she had overreacted, but pride made it hard for her to admit it. She had been running the store for years, and she didn't take kindly to anyone challenging her authority. But the woman wasn't done yet. "You're lucky that I'm not calling the police right now," she said, her voice unwavering. "You can't just slap a child, especially for something so small. What would have happened if he had been more scared? If he had gotten hurt? I don't think you've thought this through." Lydia felt her face heat up, her chest tightening with a mixture of shame and frustration. She had never been confronted like this before, especially not in front of customers. The woman's words were cutting through the tough exterior Lydia had built over the years. It was hard for her to accept, but she couldn't deny the truth in them. "I'm sorry," Lydia muttered after a long pause. The words were soft, almost a whisper. "I shouldn't have done that." The woman didn't say anything immediately. She just looked at Lydia, her eyes cold and direct. She wanted to make sure Lydia understood the weight of what had just happened. After a few long moments, the woman finally spoke again. "You should be. And if you ever treat my son or any child like that again, there will be consequences. Do you understand?" she asked, her voice calm but unyielding. Lydia nodded stiffly, not trusting herself to say anything else. She had no defense for what she had done. All she could do was stand there and take the scolding. The woman then turned to Elijah and smiled at him again. "Let's go, sweetheart," she said. "We've had enough of this place for today." Elijah looked at her, his face still a little red, but there was a sense of relief in his eyes now. He nodded and followed her toward the door, his steps a little lighter. As they walked out of the store, the woman glanced over her shoulder at Lydia one last time. There was no anger in her eyes now, just a calm certainty. After the confrontation in the store, the woman and her son left without another word, walking quietly out the door. The atmosphere in the store remained thick with tension, the silence hanging over the place like a heavy blanket. The other customers, who had been quietly observing the situation, slowly went back to what they were doing, but the mood had completely shifted. It wasn't the same place anymore, not after what had just happened. The manager, Lydia, stood behind the counter, her arms still crossed, her mind racing with thoughts of what had just unfolded. Lydia had been managing the store for years. She was used to dealing with people who weren't always respectful, especially kids who sometimes came in without a care in the world. She had grown accustomed to running things her way. Discipline, in her eyes, was about keeping control, about ensuring people followed the rules, about not letting things get out of hand. But today had been different. She had crossed a line, and she knew it. Her actions hadn't been about discipline. They hadn't been about teaching Elijah a lesson. They had been about power, about making someone feel small to remind them who was in charge. And now, with the quiet aftermath still hanging in the air, she couldn't shake the image of Elijah's face, his wide eyes, his confusion. his hurt. Lydia felt a lump form in her throat. She wasn't used to feeling guilty. She had always been the one in control, the one who decided what was right and wrong, the one who made the rules. But today something had shifted. She hadn't been right. She had been harsh, and the consequences were far more serious than she had expected. She looked at the clock on the wall. The day was dragging on, but Lydia couldn't focus on the work in front of her. She couldn't stop thinking about the mother, the woman who had confronted her so calmly, so powerfully. She had seen it in the way the woman carried herself, the way she stood up for her son, the way she hadn't backed down. The manager knew that she was used to dealing with people who were intimidated by her, but the woman had been different. She hadn't been intimidated at all. She had called Lydia out, not with anger or confrontation, but with quiet, firm authority. Lydia thought about how the woman had spoken to her. "You can't just slap a child," the words echoed in her mind. It wasn't just the slap that had shocked the woman. It was how Lydia had let her emotions get the best of her, how she had treated Elijah like he was guilty of something terrible when in reality, it had been an accident. The truth settled heavily in Lydia's chest. She hadn't just disciplined Elijah, she had humiliated him, and that was something that couldn't easily be undone. She realized that the way she had handled the situation wasn't just wrong, it was unfair. And it was something that would stay with Elijah long after he had left the store. Lydia sighed and leaned against the counter. She had made a mistake. A big one, but she couldn't figure out how to make things right. Apologizing to Elijah wasn't going to be enough. She wasn't even sure she could apologize to him directly after what had happened. It wasn't just about the slap anymore. It was about how she had made him feel, like he wasn't important, like his feelings didn't matter. The silence in the store stretched on. Lydia's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the bell above the door jingling. She glanced up and saw a few customers entering the store. For the first time that day, she was relieved to have something to focus on. She greeted them as she usually did, but her mind was elsewhere. It wasn't long before she heard the bell jingle again, and when she looked up, her heart skipped a beat. It was the woman, the one who had confronted her earlier. She walked in with a calm, composed demeanor, just as she had before, but this time she wasn't alone. Elijah was with her. Lydia's stomach churned. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew she had to face whatever was coming. She stood up straighter, trying to brace herself for whatever words the woman might have, but to her surprise, the woman didn't come storming toward her, demanding anything. Instead, she walked to the counter, Elijah by her side. The boy looked much more composed now. His shoulders no longer slumped, his face a little less tense. The woman gave Lydia a small, measured smile. It wasn't a smile of anger or frustration. It was more like a recognition of something that had happened that needed to be addressed. "I think we need to talk," the woman said, her voice calm but firm. Lydia swallowed hard. She had been dreading this moment, but now that it was here, she realized it wasn't as bad as she had imagined. The woman wasn't here to tear her down. She was here to address the issue, to speak her mind, and perhaps to find some closure for what had happened. I owe you an apology," Lydia said, the words coming out slowly. She hadn't expected to say it, but it felt right. She looked down at the counter, her hands gripping the edge. "I shouldn't have slapped your son. It was wrong, and I can see that now." The woman nodded, her expression softening. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "But what matters now is understanding why you did it and what needs to change." Lydia nodded, her throat tight. She wasn't sure what to say, but she knew the apology wasn't enough. "There was more to be done. I let my emotions get the best of me," she admitted, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "I thought I was teaching him a lesson, but really I just made him feel like he wasn't important. Like he didn't matter." The woman's eyes softened, and she placed a hand gently on Elijah's shoulder. "We all make mistakes, Lydia," she said. "The important thing is that we learn from them." Elijah, who had been standing quietly beside his mother, finally spoke. His voice was quieter than usual, but it was steady. "I'm sorry for knocking over the vase," he said, his gaze on the floor. "I didn't mean to break it." Lydia felt a pang of guilt. "You don't need to apologize," she said quickly, her voice soft. "It was my fault. I overreacted, and I shouldn't have treated you like that." Elijah looked up at her, and for a moment there was something in his eyes, something that told Lydia he understood. He had already forgiven her. The woman smiled at Elijah, then looked back at Lydia. It's good to hear you take responsibility for your actions, she said. But there's something important to remember here. Discipline is about teaching, not punishing. If we want to help our children learn, we need to show them respect, just as we would want it in return. Lydia took a deep breath, nodding. She hadn't realized before how much her approach to discipline had been about control, rather than understanding. She had always believed that if she could assert her authority, things would fall into place. But now she saw that real respect had to come from empathy, not power. "Thank you," Lydia said quietly. "I will do better next time." The woman smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. "And I hope you'll take this lesson to heart. We're all learning together, and it's never too late to change." The days that followed felt different for Lydia. She couldn't stop thinking about the incident. Every time she walked into the store, she was reminded of the woman's calm words, the way she had handled everything so gracefully. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about the change in Lydia herself, the realization that her approach to handling conflict had been flawed. She had always thought that being strict and authoritative would maintain control, but now she saw it didn't always lead to respect. It wasn't just about rules. It was about understanding, about kindness, and about the way we treat others, especially when they make mistakes. The store itself didn't change much. It still had the same shelves, the same customers, and the same familiar atmosphere. But for Lydia, it was no longer just a place where she managed transactions. It had become a space for reflection, for learning, for growing. Over the next few days, Lydia started to pay closer attention to how she interacted with people. She noticed the way she used her tone with the customers, how she sometimes spoke a little too harshly, or how she could be quick to judge. But she also noticed the moments when she was kind, when she smiled at someone who seemed down, when she took a moment to explain something patiently. Those were the moments that felt right. They felt real. One afternoon, as she was stocking some shelves, a familiar face walked into the store. It was the woman, Elijah's mother. This time she wasn't with her son, but Lydia recognized her immediately. She was dressed in business attire, as she had been the last time, her presence just as composed as before. But this time there was no tension. There was no anger or confrontation. The woman simply walked into the store like any other customer. Lydia's heart beat a little faster. She wasn't sure why, but the sight of the woman brought back all the feelings from the other day. She took a deep breath and walked toward her, her nerves slightly on edge but determined to face whatever was coming. "Good afternoon," Lydia said, her voice polite but warm. The woman looked up and smiled, her eyes meeting Lydia's. "Hello, Lydia," she said with a friendly nod. "How have you been?" Lydia was taken aback for a moment. She hadn't expected such a kind greeting after everything that had happened. She had thought the woman might be upset with her, might avoid her or give her a cold stare, but instead she was being treated like a person, not a manager who had made a mistake, but just another human being. I've been doing a lot of thinking," Lydia admitted, her voice softening as she spoke, "about everything that happened. And I just wanted to say again that I'm sorry." The woman's smile widened. "I know you're sorry," she said. "But what matters most is that you learned something from it. And I can see you have." Lydia nodded slowly. She could feel the weight of her words, how much she meant them now. "I have," she said. "I've realized that discipline isn't about making someone feel small. It's about helping them understand, helping them grow. I didn't do that before, and I regret it." The woman nodded again, clearly satisfied with Lydia's response. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. "It takes a lot to recognize your mistakes and to want to make a change. It's not always easy to do." Lydia appreciated the woman's understanding. It felt different than the first time they had spoken. There was no judgment, no harsh words, just a quiet acknowledgement of the growth that had taken place. The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they talked about the store, the neighborhood, and the changes that had come with time. But for Lydia, it wasn't just a casual conversation. It was a reminder of how much people could change when they allowed themselves to reflect. The woman wasn't just teaching her about discipline. She was teaching her about grace, about second chances. As the woman prepared to leave, she stopped at the door and turned back to Lydia. "I'm glad you're doing better," she said with a kind smile. "And I hope you continue to grow. You're doing good work here. Keep it up." Lydia smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "I will." The woman left the store and Lydia watched her go, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't just about fixing the mistake with Elijah. It was about how she had approached everything since then. The store, the people, her own actions, it was all part of a bigger picture. And Lydia was finally seeing it clearly. A few days later, there was another shift in the store. The local community was preparing for the annual neighborhood fair, an event that brought people from all over to gather, share food, and enjoy local entertainment. Lydia had been involved in previous years, but this time something felt different. As she helped set up decorations and arrange displays, she realized that she was looking at the fair with a new perspective. She wasn't just a manager at a store anymore. She was a part of something bigger. She was part of a community, and her role in it was more than just about making sales. It was about connecting with people, understanding their needs, and being there for them in ways that mattered. The fair day arrived and the store was busy as usual. But there was a lighter air in the shop. People seemed more at ease and Lydia was more relaxed. She smiled at the customers who came in, chatting with them like she never had before. She even took the time to ask a few of them how their families were doing, or if they needed help finding anything. It wasn't forced. It came naturally, a shift that felt right. In the afternoon, as the fair began to wind down, the woman and Elijah appeared again. This time, they weren't here to talk about the past. They were here to enjoy the event just like everyone else. Elijah had a small cup of cotton candy in his hand, and he looked happy, genuinely happy. Lydia watched them from across the store, feeling a sense of peace. She had changed, and so had the way she viewed the world. It wasn't just about the rules anymore. It was about being human, about being kind, and about finding understanding in every situation. The woman noticed Lydia watching from across the room and smiled. She walked over, her son beside her, and they both greeted Lydia with a friendly wave. "How's the fair going?" the woman asked. "It's going great," Lydia replied, her voice light and warm. "It's been a nice change seeing everyone come together like this." "It's good to see you happy," the woman said, a knowing look in her eyes. "You've come a long way," Lydia smiled. "I'm still learning, but I'm getting there." As the evening went on, Lydia found herself laughing with the customers, chatting with her neighbors, and even sharing stories with the woman and Elijah. The conversation was easy, lighthearted, and filled with the kind of genuine connection Lydia had been missing for so long. When the fair finally ended, and the crowd began to disperse, Lydia stood outside the store for a moment, watching the last few stragglers head home. The stars were just starting to appear in the sky, and the air was cool and peaceful. Lydia took a deep breath and realized that she had finally found a sense of balance. She had made mistakes, but she had learned from them, and she was determined to continue growing. The woman and Elijah walked by once more, and Lydia waved goodbye to them. She had learned something valuable from their brief encounter, something that had shifted her perspective forever. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about trying, about learning, and about making each day a little better than the last. The days after the fair seemed to carry a quiet kind of calm that Lydia wasn't used to. The store continued to run as it always had, but for her everything felt just a little different. She was no longer only focused on keeping things in order. She was learning to connect with the people who walked through her doors, seeing them not as customers but as individuals with their own stories and struggles. One evening, as the store began to slow down, Lydia sat behind the counter, organizing receipts and checking inventory. Her mind drifted back to the events of the past few weeks, the slap, the apology, the lessons she had learned along the way. She could still hear the words the woman had said to her, gentle but firm. "Discipline is about teaching, not punishing." Those words had stuck with her, making her think about how she approached everything in her life, not just with customers, but with herself too. It wasn't long before the bell above the door jingled, signaling the arrival of a customer. Lydia looked up, expecting another regular to come in for their evening shopping. But when she saw who had walked in, her heart skipped a beat. It was the woman, the one who had stood up for her son, the one who had changed everything. This time she wasn't alone. Elijah was with her, and he was holding a small bouquet of flowers in his hand. He looked a little older, a little more grown up since the last time she had seen him. Lydia stood up, her hands instinctively brushing off the counter as she greeted them with a warm smile. "Good evening," she said, her voice genuine and friendly. "What can I do for you today?" The woman smiled back, her expression as kind and composed as always. "We just came by to say thank you," she said, holding up the bouquet. "Elijah wanted to bring you these, for all the lessons you've learned and for treating us with respect." Lydia was taken aback for a moment. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anything from them, really, other than perhaps a simple acknowledgement of the situation. But this was something else entirely. Elijah stepped forward and handed her the flowers with a shy smile. "Thank you for being so nice to me," he said, his voice soft but sincere. Lydia took the bouquet from him, her hands trembling slightly. She hadn't realized how much those simple words would mean to her. She looked at Elijah, and for the first time, she saw him not just as the boy she had scolded, but as someone who had been affected by her actions, someone who had learned alongside her. "You didn't have to do this," Lydia said quietly, looking down at the flowers. "But thank you. They're beautiful." Elijah's smile widened. "We just wanted to show you that we appreciate you." Lydia swallowed the lump in her throat. It was hard to put into words how much this moment meant to her. "I'm the one who should be thanking you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You helped me see things in a way I never could have before." "I've learned so much from you both," the woman nodded, her gaze soft. "We all learn from each other. It's the way the world works. And you've come a long way, Lydia. We all have." Lydia's eyes met the woman's, and in that moment, she saw something that made her heart swell, a shared understanding, a connection that went beyond apologies and mistakes. It was about growth, about finding common ground, and about recognizing that no one was perfect, but that didn't mean they couldn't try to do better. The woman and Elijah didn't stay long. They chatted briefly about the store, about the neighborhood, and about Elijah's plans for the future. It was easy conversation, the kind you have when you're comfortable with someone, when you've moved past the hard moments and come out stronger. As they made their way toward the door, the woman turned to Lydia one last time. "We'll be back soon," she said with a smile. "Take care, Lydia. Keep doing what you're doing." Lydia watched them leave, the door jingling softly as it closed behind them. She stood there for a moment, the bouquet still in her hands, trying to process everything that had just happened. She hadn't expected anything from them, but here they were offering her their gratitude, their understanding. The days after the fair passed by quietly, but for Lydia, each day seemed like a new chapter of growth. The quiet routine of running the store had taken on a different rhythm. She wasn't just counting inventory or processing sales. Now she found herself reflecting on her interactions, considering her words, and being more mindful of the way she treated everyone who walked through the door. The store had become a place of learning, not just for the customers, but for Lydia as well. One morning, just as the sun began to rise, Lydia arrived early to open the store. It was still quiet outside, the streets barely lit by the streetlights. The usual hum of the neighborhood hadn't yet started, and there was a peaceful calm in the air. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, taking in the familiar sights, the shelves, the aisles, the rows of products neatly arranged. But today everything felt different. It felt like the beginning of something new. Lydia had learned a lot in the past few weeks, but the most important lesson had been about understanding the people around her, about offering kindness, and about recognizing that every mistake was an opportunity to grow. She knew she still had more to learn, but she was no longer afraid of making mistakes. In fact, she welcomed them because she knew they would lead to something better. As she started her morning routine, organizing the store, she heard the familiar jingle of the doorbell. Lydia looked up, surprised to see the woman from the other day entering again. This time she was alone. There was no rush in her steps, no tension in the air, just a calm presence that seemed to fill the space. She walked toward the counter with a warm smile, and Lydia immediately felt a sense of relief. "Good morning," the woman greeted, her voice soft and friendly. "Good morning," Lydia replied, surprised by the woman's return. "What brings you here today?" The woman shrugged lightly. "Just picking up a few things," she said, "but I wanted to check in. See how you're doing." Lydia's heart warmed at the kindness. "I'm doing well, actually. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, and I've realized I've got a lot to work on, but I'm on the right path now." The woman smiled knowingly. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. Sometimes the hardest part is just admitting that you can do better. But once you do, everything else starts to fall into place. Lydia nodded, grateful for the woman's understanding. I think I've learned that. It's not just about the rules or the way I've always done things. It's about seeing the people in front of me, understanding their needs and treating them with respect no matter the situation. The woman's smile grew wider. Exactly, she said. That's the key. When you treat people with respect, they respond to you differently. They open up, they trust you, and that's when real connections are made. Lydia reflected on the truth of the woman's words. She had always thought that being firm and direct was the best way to gain respect. But now she understood that kindness and empathy were just as important. She had seen the change in her customers, the way they interacted with her differently now that she had started to treat them as equals instead of just transactions. As they continued talking, Lydia realized that she didn't need to be perfect. She just needed to keep learning and improving. There would still be challenges, but she was no longer afraid of them. In fact, she welcomed them because she knew that each challenge was an opportunity to do better. So, how's Elijah doing? Lydia asked, wanting to know how the boy was after everything that had happened. The woman's face softened and she nodded. He's doing well. He's a bit more careful now, but he's also become more confident. I think he learned something too about how to handle situations when they go wrong. Lydia's heart lifted at the thought. She had been worried about how Elijah would remember the incident, whether it would affect him in the long run. But it seemed that he had taken it in stride, learning from the experience just as she had. That's good to hear, Lydia said with a smile. I'm glad he's doing better. After a few more minutes of casual conversation, the woman paid for her items and turned to leave. I'm really proud of you, Lydia, she said before walking toward the door. You've come a long way. Lydia felt a rush of gratitude. Thank you, she said. I couldn't have done it without your support. As the woman left, Lydia stood at the counter for a moment, reflecting on the journey she had been on. The changes in her life weren't just about the way she ran the store. They were about the way she viewed herself and the world around her. She had learned that respect, kindness, and understanding were the foundations of real connections. And that was something she would carry with her every day. A few weeks passed, and Lydia's routine began to feel more natural. She was still learning, still adjusting to the changes in herself, but the store felt more like a place of growth than it ever had before. The customers who came in every day noticed the difference too. They were more willing to talk, more willing to share, and more willing to ask for help when they needed it. The walls that Lydia had unknowingly put up between herself and others were starting to come down, one conversation at a time. One afternoon, as Lydia was restocking the shelves, she saw a familiar face walk into the store. It was a young woman, someone who had visited the store many times before. She had a warm smile, and she often chatted with Lydia while shopping. The woman had always seemed friendly, but today she looked a bit different, more serious, more focused. Hey there, Lydia said as the woman approached the counter. Hey, Lydia, the woman replied, her voice quieter than usual. I actually need to ask you for some advice. Lydia was surprised. She had always thought of the woman as someone who was confident and self-assured. Of course, she said, her curiosity piqued. What's on your mind? The woman hesitated for a moment, glancing down at her hands. I've been struggling lately, she said, her voice a little shaky. There's a lot going on and I just don't know how to handle everything. Lydia felt a pang of empathy. I get it, she said softly. Life can be really overwhelming sometimes, but you don't have to handle it alone. The woman nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I know, she said. I just feel like I'm losing control. I don't know what to do. Lydia felt a connection to the woman's words. She had felt that same sense of helplessness not too long ago, when everything had seemed out of her control. You know, Lydia said gently. I've been there. I know what it's like to feel like everything is falling apart. But the thing I've learned is that we can always start over. It doesn't matter how many times we fall. What matters is how we rise each time. The woman looked at Lydia, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Do you really believe that? She asked, almost as if she were testing Lydia's words. Lydia smiled, a small but genuine smile. I do, I've had to learn it the hard way. But I believe that every day is a new chance. You can take it one step at a time, one day at a time, and you'll get through it. The woman stood still for a moment, processing Lydia's words. Then she smiled, a small, hopeful smile. Thank you, Lydia, she said softly. I really needed to hear that. Lydia smiled back. Anytime. You're not alone in this. We all have our struggles, but we can get through them together. As the woman left the store, Lydia stood there for a moment, reflecting on how far she had come. The lessons she had learned were no longer just abstract ideas. They were part of her life, part of the way she viewed the world and others. She had made mistakes, but those mistakes had helped her grow, and now she was able to share that growth with others to help them through their struggles, just as she had been helped. Lydia's heart swelled with a quiet sense of pride. She had learned so much, and she knew there was still so much more to learn. But for the first time in her life, she was ready for it all. It was a reminder that kindness could change everything, that people could forgive and move forward, that mistakes didn't have to define who you were. The store was quieter now. The evening had settled in, and the soft hum of the refrigerator and the rustle of paper bags filled the air. Lydia took a deep breath and placed the flowers in a vase on the counter. The vibrant colors of the petals stood out against the dull light of the store, a symbol of the change that had taken place, not just in the store but within her. As she stood there, looking at the flowers, Lydia realized that this was only the beginning. She had learned how to listen, how to understand, how to be patient, but there was still so much more to learn. She knew that life would continue to challenge her, that she would make mistakes again, but now she also knew that those mistakes didn't have to be the end of the story. They could be lessons, opportunities to grow, to become better. The next morning, Lydia woke up early, feeling more energized than she had in weeks. The air outside was crisp, the sky a pale blue as the sun began to rise. She opened the store early, as usual, and as she stood behind the counter, she noticed something. The customers who came in that day seemed different. They were more engaged, more open. She greeted them with the same warmth she had learned to offer, and they responded with the same kindness. It felt like the store had become a place where people could connect, where they could share small moments of understanding and empathy. Later that afternoon, a young boy walked in, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his eyes on the floor. He had the same nervous energy that Lydia had seen in Elijah just a few weeks before. He was holding a small item in his hand, a toy that had been knocked off the shelf earlier. The boy seemed to hesitate for a moment, unsure of what to do. Lydia stepped forward and smiled at him. "Hey there," she said gently. "Looks like you've got something to return." The boy nodded, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Lydia crouched down to his level, just like she had done for Elijah. "Hey, accidents happen," she said softly. "I'm just glad you're being responsible and bringing it back." The boy looked up at her, surprised by her response. He had expected to be scolded, but instead he found kindness. He smiled a little, his shoulders relaxing. "Thank you," he said shyly, then handed her the toy. Lydia smiled, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. She had learned that the way you treat others can change everything. It wasn't about rules and punishment. It was about understanding, patience, and the willingness to see things from someone else's perspective. As the day went on, Lydia continued to interact with her customers in this new way, letting go of the old habits that had held her back. The store, once just a place of work, had become a place of connection. It wasn't perfect and it didn't always go smoothly, but it was real, and that was enough. By the time the sun set, Lydia felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in a long time. The lessons she had learned, the apologies she had made, the connections she had forged, it all felt like a beginning, not an end. She wasn't the same person who had slapped Elijah that day. She was better now, stronger and more compassionate. And as she locked up the store for the night, she knew that the journey wasn't over. It was just getting started. Lydia stood there for a while longer, feeling a quiet sense of pride. She had come a long way, and while she knew she still had much to learn, she was ready for whatever came next. With that, the woman turned to leave, Elijah following closely behind her. As they reached the door, the woman paused and looked back at Lydia one last time. "Take care of yourself." "Lydia," she said with a small smile, before the door jingled again and they were gone. Lydia stood there for a long time thinking about what had just happened. It wasn't easy to admit that she had been wrong, but she knew that it was the first step toward being better. The store, which had once felt like a place of control, suddenly seemed quieter, more peaceful. And for the first time that day, Lydia felt like she had learned something important. She would never forget what happened here, but she knew the store manager would remember it too. And that would be enough to be broken glass.